This Notebook LM video explores how the earliest Christian communities gathered and worshiped, long before cathedrals and formal institutions. For the first 300 years, church referred to the people gathered, not a physical building. Christianity originated within Judaism, initially worshiping in synagogues until no longer welcome.
Hey everyone. So when you think of the very first Christian church, what pops into your head? Is it a giant cathedral with stained glass windows? Well, it might surprise you, but for the first few hundred years, it was nothing like that. So let's get into it. What were those early gatherings actually like? Right. So when we hear the word church today, our minds probably jump to something like the image on the left, a special building, often pretty grand, that you go to. But for the first 300 years of Christianity, the reality was a lot more like the image on the right. See, church wasn't a place you went. It was the people you gathered with. And that gathering usually happened in the simple setting of someone's home. So if the church was really just a bunch of people meeting in a house, what did that actually look like? I mean, what did they do? What would it have felt like to be there? To figure that out, we've got to go right back to the very beginning. Okay, first things first. To get a handle on the early church, we have to understand its roots. This wasn't some movement that just appeared out of thin air. Nope, it began firmly planted in the world of first-century Judaism. This is so important to remember. Jesus and all his apostles were Jewish. They weren't setting out to start a brand new religion. In their minds, they were part of a movement within Judaism that believed the Messiah had finally come. So naturally, their first places of worship were synagogues, right up until the point they weren't welcome anymore. And that moment, being pushed out of the synagogues, is what gave birth to the house church. This wasn't really a choice. It was a necessity. Believers started gathering in the homes of members who had enough space to host everyone, which often meant the wealthier folks in the group. And as the threat from Roman authorities got more serious, these simple homes became more than just meeting places. They became secret, sacred sanctuaries. So what was the focus when they were in these homes? Well, the book of Acts gives us this perfect little summary that basically became their blueprint. It boils down to 4 things: apostolic teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, and prayer. These weren't just items on a checklist. They were the pillars holding the whole community up. So we've got the location, a home, and we've got the focus, those 4 pillars. Now let's step inside and really see what one of these meetings would have looked and felt like, from the food, to the songs, to the teaching. A typical meeting was, well, a full-on experience. The centerpiece was a shared meal, what they called an agape feast, which literally means a love feast. But it was more than just dinner. They would read scripture aloud, pray together as a group, sing hymns, and take up a collection to care for the poor in their community. It was really participatory. Everybody was involved. But that big communal meal, which was supposed to be all about unity, also created some real tension. You have to remember, Sunday wasn't a day off in the Roman Empire. So wealthier members who had more free time could show up early and get all the good food. But laborers and slaves, they'd show up late after a long day of work, and sometimes they'd find that not much was left. It was a real-world test of their ideals about equality. And this tension actually shows us what their biggest priority was. Because while feeding everyone was important, the teaching of Scripture was number 1. As the apostles say in the book of Acts, their main job was the ministry of the word, not waiting on tables. Spiritual food always, always came first. So as these communities grew over the decades, their gatherings started to get a little more organized, a little more structured. And luckily for us, we have this incredible historical snapshot, a detailed blueprint, really, of a service from around the year 1500. The reason we know this is thanks to an early Christian writer named Justin Martyr. He wrote a letter to the Roman emperor, and in it, he laid out the whole order of a typical Sunday service. Now, he wasn't writing a how-to guide for other believers. He was explaining their practices to an outsider, and that gives us this incredibly valuable, objective look at what they were doing. So here it is, the order of service Justin Martyr laid out. First, they started with a ton of readings from what they called the Memoirs of the Apostles, what we call the Gospels, and from the Old Testament prophets. After all that reading, the leader would give a sermon to explain it all. Then, the whole community would stand up for prayer. After that came the Eucharist, where baptized members shared bread and wine. And finally, the service wrapped up with a voluntary collection for anyone in need. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should. The DNA of so many modern church services is right here. That first part of the service, the readings and the sermon, was actually really similar to a Jewish synagogue service. So what made it uniquely Christian? Well, it was the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. That ritual of sharing bread and wine to remember Jesus' death and resurrection, that became the central, defining act of Christian worship. But these gatherings were about so much more than just a worship service. They were building a totally new and radical kind of community, one that was completely turning social norms upside down. Let's take a look at what that meant for their everyday lives. You have to understand just how revolutionary this statement from the Apostle Paul was. Think about the Roman world. It was deeply, deeply divided by ethnicity, by legal status, by gender. The idea that everyone, a Jew and a Greek, a slave and a free person, could be seen as truly one, truly equal in a single community, that was a massive social disruption. And this wasn't just some nice idea they talked about, they really lived it. This description from Acts paints a picture of a community with this incredible sense of responsibility for each other. They literally held all things in common, selling their own property to create a fund to take care of anyone in the group who needed help. Their faith was just intensely practical and incredibly generous. So where did all of that money from the weekly collection go? Well, there were no building maintenance costs, no staff salaries to pay. Instead, it was their social safety net. The money went to support the most vulnerable people: orphans, widows, the sick, people in prison, and even strangers who were just passing through. It was a community built on radical, hands-on care. All right, so when we step back and look at this whole picture of the early church, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting legacy of these simple, powerful home gatherings? This timeline gives you a really quick overview of how it all evolved. It started super informally in synagogues and homes. As persecution got worse, the meetings had to go underground into secret house churches. By the mid-2nd century, you can see their services had a clear structure. And it actually wasn't until Christianity was legalized in the 4th century that we finally see the rise of dedicated public church buildings. So, at the end of the day, the first churches weren't really defined by their buildings at all, but by their character. Their whole identity was wrapped up in their simple devotion, their radical community that just erased social lines, and their profound, life-changing generosity. And that kind of leaves us with one last thought. In our world today, with all the giant buildings and highly polished online services, what can we learn from the simple, heartfelt, and deeply communal devotion of those very first Christians? It's something to think about.